vaccine, because of course we want the world to get back to normal, as close to normal as possible. But just send me your questions if possible, and then we will open it up. So I know Dr. Alozi likes to take questions during the presentation, which is great. But now we have, I think, maybe 155, 160 people online. So if it's something that you feel can wait, then just put it in the chat. If you need to ask it immediately, feel free to go ahead and jump in. This is a really trusting, safe environment. So feel free to ask whatever you want to ask. If it's something that's really private, you can just send it to myself directly, Dr. Alozi, Dr. Moore, or Mr. Redmond. I would also love to bring Dory McWhorter online if possible. She is the CEO of the YWCA in Chicago, and her team supported this event. They prepared the flyer. They did social media blast for us. So we really appreciate them. Dory, do you have anything you would like to say? Ty, can you open up her mic?
Yes, I just made her a co-host so she can unmute herself.
Okay. Dory, if you have anything to say, you can say it. If you want to hold your comments to the end, that's great as well.
I just wanted to quickly thank you, Chastity, but also thank everyone for joining and continuing to spread the word even while we're online, because I just want everyone to hear this. Chicago, as you all know, I know the doctors know this, have been experiencing such a high disproportionate death rate. And so Chastity, I just so appreciate, among Black and brown people, I should say. So Chastity, I still appreciate you bringing this and letting us participate, and just hope the chat gets filled with questions, because we so need our people to hear this. So thank you for taking the lead on this. And thank you, Ty, good to see you.
Thank you. Again, if anyone has any questions up front about how things are going to operate, please go ahead and ask us now. But if not, then we're going to go ahead and let Dr. Alozi and Dr. Moore begin their presentation. Again, if it's something that you feel like you're going to forget, go ahead, chime in. We want to see your face on camera. We want to engage with you, but if it's something that you think you could wait until the end, then go ahead and hold it to the end, and then we'll let everyone. We're going to have a really great Q&A session. Everything is open. Everything is on the table. If you have conspiracy theories, if you have someone told you you might grow a third eye, don't feel like it's a dumb question. There's no such thing as a dumb question. This is like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We have two of the best experts online, so please feel free to ask whatever you have, okay? Dr. Alozi and Dr. Moore, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, let's go.
Ready as we'll ever be. All right. All right. Of course, I had to cough now. Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. Thank you to YWCA of Chicago. Thank you, Mr. Porter, for hosting this an immense social media presence, and really happy to be here on a Saturday. Dr. Moore and I are going to try to navigate this as much as possible. Principal Redmond, thank you for setting the technical details up on this. And Ms. Johnson, thank you for being our host and moderator. I think how myself and Dr. Moore are going to approach this, think of this like a Sunday football game. I'm going to be play-by-play, and Dr. Moore, as the money guy, he's going to be like Tony Romo and do the color commentary. And so we're going to dive right in. Can everybody see my screen? Excellent. All right. Really simple overview. And I think, like Ms. Johnson said, we may stop from time to time to sort of take questions depending on how the flow goes, and we'll just kind of go from there. But I think it's important to understand the vaccine overview and development. How are we going to distribute this thing, right? And what are the issues that we've had with vaccine distribution to date? What are the concerns? Right? What are the concerns with this vaccine in terms of safety, in terms of the conspiracy theories that you may have heard, in terms of the vaccine hesitancy that exists in our communities, and how are we going to get around that? And I think it's important at the end, myself and Dr. Moore will really say, hey, shot or no shot? Have we gotten the shot? Do we plan to get the shot? Do we plan that our family members get the shot? And so we'll kind of go from there. Hopefully, you have seen this. This is a pictorial representation of the coronavirus, called corona because of the crown, the spikes that are on the edge of it. And this is really what has dominated our lives and our news and everything that we've done essentially since December of 2019, since it was first reported out of the Wuhan province. I'm going to give a timeline, and then as I go on, because Dr. Moore is the expert in this space, I'll sort of let him speak. But I think it's important to sort of recap 2020 and really remember where we were and where we've gone. It's been an immense and amazing year in terms of the pace of science. And so it was, again, mentioned that November, December, Wuhan province, we started getting our first cases in the United States officially in March. Some of the RNA have shown that it was probably existing back in February. But by the time we got to April and May, we were already talking about masking. We were talking about, wow, this can affect the heart, the blood, the kidneys. There was the whole remdesivir conversation, right? And Gilead came out with remdesivir as a medication that could not cure COVID, but could change the duration that somebody stayed in the hospital, right? So it blunted the effect, but not necessarily changed the effect on mortality. We went through the whole hydroxychloroquine, I'll just kind of call it a debacle. I'll be really blunt about it. The whole hydroxychloroquine debacle. We found out that steroids, right, one of the cheapest medications that we still have in existence to date, still the only medication randomized controlled trial with enough people to actually say this has some effect that can actually change mortality, can actually help people survive that have severe COVID. June, July, we started hearing about, oh, wow, so this might last longer than just an acute illness. I might have this for months or years, the so-called long COVID or chronic COVID syndrome. We'll talk about that. And then the exciting stuff really started to happen, right? So the United States and Europe, China, Russia as well started to get into that vaccine space. And by November, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna revealed that their vaccines had on average 95% efficacy, and now we're getting vaccines in arms. And so 2020 has really been the year of COVID, but not just that, the year of science. Dr. Moore, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think you opened it up perfectly. This was a situation where, we started back in late February. My lab got tapped to participate in this project, and so to go from early January, February, people starting to talk about it. One case pops up on the West Coast over in Washington State, and next thing you know, now where we are here. You walk outside, everybody you see, at least in my area, I'm in Maryland, in the Maryland, DC area, you see everybody with a mask. And so you see how that situation grew out of control and was just completely, it was fumbled from the beginning, largely because of the lack of leadership and telling people to mask. And masking is and does work. So I want to make that clear. Masking is and does work. But we also have to get vaccinated. So, but you open it up exactly right. And I think the timeline is perfect. And so to go from this virus being essentially being a thought or a conversation to there being a vaccine available, if anything else, there should be a situation where people are knocking the door down trying to get vaccinated, because we know that it's real. We know that it is, we know that the cost of not taking it serious can be either severe illness or in many cases, death. So I completely agree with you. So I'm gonna let you go ahead, and I like this play-by-play. I like this rhythm right here. So I'm gonna put my headset back on and jump back in when you hand it back to me.
Absolutely, I appreciate it, my friend.
Yeah.
And so kind of going forward, right? I need people to also understand, right? And this is sort of just talk to what Dr. Moore referred, which is people have to understand that in as much as this started in February, this is a worldwide effort, and there's actually some background behind it. So I think that's important. And so if you look at this global map of what were the countries that were looking to do vaccine, right? There's a lot of places, the United States, obviously, Europe, China, Russia, Australia. By the time we got to October of last year, these were really the real candidates, right? And actually, these are the ones where we say, hey, this may actually be working. I think it's important just to take a look and see where we are right now. So 36 in phase 1, 25 in phase 2, 20 in phase 3, authorized 3, approved for full use, and candidates drop off the list. And so again, I'll send this out through Ms. Johnson and Principal Redmond so that you can look at it. But again, a host of data that's been accumulated over hundreds of trials. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We've actually been blessed in the United States that our first two candidates were approximately 95% efficacy. Interestingly enough, that is probably going to create some downstream problems when we start to talk about some of the other candidates, right? But again, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, but kind of take it from there.
Can I add some perspective right there?
Absolutely.
All right. So you mentioned a good point. So the first two vaccines that came out, of course, the Moderna vaccine, which I was involved with, and then the Pfizer vaccine, 95% and 94% or 95% roughly efficacious. And so then you have other companies that are going to be coming out, and some of them are in the 60s, some of them in the 70s. So I want to put that in perspective. My background is actually influenza research. So before I actually took this position, I was a PhD student in the influenza lab, and we did vaccine development in that capacity. Some of the most effective flu vaccines that you have taken, potentially have taken in the past, were only 50 or 60% effective. And so, but people were taking them and they were fairly protective, 50, 60% efficacy. I think 50% efficacy is what it needs to get FDA approval. So 60% efficacy is really good. So now you have something shoot up to 95%. Anything that comes below that is now going to be looked at with a questioning glance. And so, but what you have to do is, and I'm sure Dr. Alozzi is going to mention this later, but you have to pay attention to the certain numbers, not just the number 50 or 60, but the number that's associated with protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death.
Absolutely, I appreciate it.
Dr. Alozzi, back to you.
Yep, thank you, sir. And so I think, as Dr. Moore sort of said too, and I think this is really important for people to understand, when you think about the research around vaccines, we're new because it's an mRNA vaccine, but this has been going on for a while, right? And I think it's important for people to understand that the family that COVID-19 is in, the coronavirus family, we knew about this back in 2002 with SARS. We also knew about it in 2012 with MERS. That laid the foundation for scientists across the world, including Dr. Moore's lab, to have an inclination and sort of a back door through which they could get to this quickly. And so that's where that speed comes in. People will say, well, I don't really understand, right? I mean, back before, we've had all these other diseases and we've never had a vaccine this quickly. And you're absolutely right. We haven't had it because guess what? We didn't have the same technology. 20 years ago, we didn't have an iPhone 12. It doesn't mean that you don't still have a phone. You still have a phone. 20 years ago, Teslas didn't exist. And yet people get in them and drive all over the place, right? And so I think we have to understand that as a human race, we get better. And this is a good thing. The other thing that this is also driven by, and taking politics aside, the power of Operation Warp Speed was immense. And so these are some of the companies and some of the monies that they received by Operation Warp Speed. And whether it's J&J, they got $1 billion, AstraZeneca 1.2, Moderna 1.53, Novavax 1.6. That money, that federal stimulus that went into these companies to get through a global pandemic was essential, on top of the brilliant minds of people like Dr. Moore and others, to get to where we needed to be. It also allowed these companies to do parallel testing as opposed to sequential. What usually happens is that you run a trial and they're like, I think I need $500 million. Who's going to give me $500 million? And then you wait 5 years for somebody to give you $500 million. Then you go to phase 2. Then you go to phase 3, looking for another $500 million. In this case, once preliminary data show that, hey, this might work, they stacked it. And so they could run trials at the same time, understanding that the money was available. And so again, it's not a conspiracy, it's science and it's money. At the end of the day, it's all about money. I tell my students all the time, if you want to find out the reality of something, figure out where the dollars came from. And again, I think that's important for people to understand.
Exactly. So, can I add a point there? All right. And so on that, to acknowledge the obvious thing, I mean, my lab and the NIH in general were recipients of Operation Warp Speed money. I do think that probably was a poor choice in name. Just to be honest, I mean, you could have named it anything else, Operation Kill Virus, anything, but Operation Warp Speed, I think that was just a poor choice of name. But as you were explaining, it is a situation where somebody wrote a check and said, hey, go for it. And essentially we're in a pandemic. So yeah, there are vaccines that in the past that have taken many years to develop, but most of those vaccines were not developed in the midst of a pandemic. I use the example of, you know, everybody on this call, if you have a house or an apartment or whatever you live in, imagine if you wanted to build your own house. Imagine you building your own house, you have the land, but you have to buy all the supplies, you build it yourself, nobody else helps you. How long do you think it takes to build that house? It would take you would probably have to live in it for years before it's complete. Now, imagine if somebody in your neighborhood, a neighbor said, you know what, we want you in this neighborhood so bad, I'm gonna cover all the fees for you to build this house. And imagine if all the neighbors that currently live there said, hey, you know what, we're all gonna come, we're in the middle of a pandemic, gonna come and help you build this house. How long do you think it takes to build that house? The house is now built in months compared to years. So that is essentially what happens here. All hands on deck, and then the money is there. So as Dr. Alozi said, these trials, some of the trials were run in parallel, but they were not rushed and they were done in the correct way. But there was nothing else to do because there was nothing more important than the pandemic that we were in the middle of and that we are in the middle of. All right.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. And so to give people sort of a timeline of where we are or where we've come from, you can see the sort of sequential approach, right? So in December, fast forward to October, the enrollment of over 74,000 people, and now we're actually getting shots in arms. And I think that's the exciting thing. Dr. Moore, I'm going to let you sort of walk through how the vaccine actually works, because I know there's a lot of people that ask me this all the time. And I try in my very sort of small infectious disease way to drive it, but I'm going to let a scientist do that.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to use, I'm going to try to use relatable examples to make it understood. So imagine that so we know, as Dr. Alozi showed, and as this illustration shows, you see the spike proteins, the spikes that are on the outside of this virus particle. Now those spikes, imagine those spikes are like a key. The spikes are keys, and you have locks that are just hanging out on your cells. All the cells in your body, certain cells in your body have a lock. This spike has a key. If in a normal circumstance, this virus gets into your body, makes contact with cells in your lung, it docks, just like a plane landing on the tarmac. It lands on the cell, and so the minute those spikes make contact with the lock or the receptors that are on your cell, it opens and the virus is allowed to go into the cell, and it's allowed to now take over your cell. This virus hijacks your cell. It tells your cells, hey, look, I'm running this right now. I want you to do anything else but make me. So it starts to give instructions on how to make more proteins to build new viruses that essentially will bud off that cell and go and infect other cells in your body. So that's how the virus works. So now what we have done, we've taken that a similar method, but imagine now those spikes we said they're keys. So now we have taken the information that we know how to make a key, and we give that to your cells in your arm. You get an injection in your arm, and so those muscle cells, they have all the same stuff that all the cells in the other parts of your body have. That instruction goes into the cell, and in the cell, there's a structure called a ribosome. The ribosome is going to essentially translate what you are asking it to make. It makes those spike proteins. It doesn't have virus in it. It doesn't, the spike protein itself can't do anything to you, but it takes that spike protein and it makes it. And now you have something that the body can use to identify the virus when it comes into contact. So your body makes the spike protein. The spike protein goes to the surface of those cells, and immune cells in your body say, hey, that's not supposed to be in here. So then they go and report back to their buddy, say, hey, this guy has a spike protein. It's not supposed to be in here. I think we need to get ready just in case somebody comes around that looks like this. So now those guys and those buddies are antibodies that you see here that look like little Ys. Now what happens is the next time, now that you have an antibody response following the vaccine, the next time that your body is exposed to the virus comes in, it's like, oh, I'm getting ready to land on a cell. I have my keys, you have your locks. But what happens is those antibodies have been waiting. The B cells in your body, they produce antibodies, they're waiting. They release all these antibodies. Those antibodies physically inhibit, they coat these viral particles. They block the key. Imagine you trying to put your key in the door and get in your house and somebody keeps putting their hand over the lock. That's exactly what goes on here. And so now the virus can't dock on the cells. It can't be taken in, and therefore it can't get inside your cells to replicate. And so that's where the technology comes in. We give the instruction to help the body recognize the keys or the spikes without giving you the virus. And that's specifically for the mRNA vaccines.
Absolutely. And, you know, as Dr. Moore sort of said, and I found this cartoon on Twitter a couple of weeks back, it's probably longer than a couple, but I mean, literally, like you said, it's like random loose mRNA lying around in your deltoid, right? Post-shot, nobody says nothing. And the ribosome that he spoke to says, hey, let me go ahead and transcribe this. And then the macrophage is like, hey, yo, check out this cool spike protein I found. And the T cell's like, dog, what's that? Get rid of that. Where's Bob? Bob's the B cell. Bob's like, yep. Like, if that ever shows up here again, don't let it in. And Bob's like, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, as the case may be. And it's a simplistic way, right, to sort of break down what Dr. Moore said. But again, that's essentially how these vaccines work. And again, sort of simplified, it's they use the sequence of the spike protein to synthesize an mRNA blueprint. It goes into the body and it tells your body to create the protein. It does not produce the virus. So you cannot get infected by the vaccine. Critically important. The protein signals Bob, your B cell, and T cells, and natural killer cells, and a whole host of other cells that we actually don't talk about enough to activate to fight against future infection. And then your body gets rid of the mRNA. And so for those of you who are younger, who have social media, mRNA vaccine is like Snapchat. Right? It goes into your body, it's a quick picture, and it's gone. You can't have it anymore. You can't see it anymore. Your body remembers it. And the next time that picture shows up again, it's like, oh, I know how to deal with this. And that's essentially how vaccines work. Dr. Moore?
Yeah. So one more point about that. mRNA vaccines, even though up until this point, there were no licensed vaccines that were mRNA, that was actually, that was in part due to the fact that mRNA, if you give it just by itself, uncoated, you give it to the body would degrade it. So that's why it's one of the safest vaccine platforms you can use, point blank across the board. But it was having issues being effective because the body would just destroy it. That just goes to show you how sensitive and how sensitive it is to being in the body. But what happened is they got very smart and said, you know what, we have to be able to protect this mRNA until it can get into the cell. So then that's when they wrapped it in lipid. So lipid or fat, they wrap it in these nanoparticles. And now, if you imagine you're you're washing dishes and you have soap on your hands, you can pick up another bubble when you have soap on your hands because your hand is coated in the same material. But if you had a dry hand touching a bubble, it'll pop. That's the same the same principle here. You wrap it in lipid, it protects it, it gets into the cell, then it can do its job. But before that, and so that's why these vaccines are so unique. So that's the part that I want to make sure that people understand. The mRNA vaccines are safe. They've just figured out recently how to get them inside the cell more reliably. And now they work very well. And that's why you have 90 and 95% efficacy versus some of the lower numbers that we've had for traditional vaccines.
Absolutely. All right. So we're going to take a step further now and talk about the actual vaccines that exist, right? So we'll just tee it up almost in sequential order. So the Pfizer, BioNTech, their partners, an American company and a German company specifically. And this is sort of an overview. I'm not going to make this data heavy. There's some that want to see the data. And so again, we'll share this with the YWCA so in Chicago so that they can get it to people. But I think the important thing here is this graph. If you haven't seen this graph, it's been everywhere, right? Whether it's on presentations like this, CNN, Fox News, online. This is, I think, one of the graphs of 2020, right? Even if you've never done a clinical trial before and somebody tells you, do these two drugs act the same? This line tells you absolutely not. Something's going on with line blue that's different than line red. The important thing here is that the red line is the vaccine group. And up at the top, you can actually see that the lines so everybody got vaccine on day 0 and they start to break apart at day 11 or 12. So there's the belief that there is some protection provided initially around day 11 or 12. And then you get that second shot at 21 days or 28 days, depending on which of the vaccination brands you're receiving, but that provides the protection. And it's really important for people to understand that. I think this graph does a great job of also explaining that in the vaccine group, which is on the left side of your screen, well, it's on my left, there are 8 people that got COVID, 1 severely ill. And in the placebo group, 162 got COVID and 9 severely ill. That's the 95% efficacy. And that's what we continue to see in other population studies. And I think Israel has really shown the best efficacy of how vaccine can start to change the tenor of COVID in a country. They're at 30% of their country having COVID, and they're already seeing a remarkable decrease in cases and hospitalizations and potentially deaths. So I think all of those are yet to be seen. People always say, well, doc, if I get this vaccine, what's going to happen to me, man? I hear people get sick and they get hospitalized by the vaccine. I think the first answer is no, that's not how that works. But I think more importantly, let's look at the data, right? We always knew that after the second dose, 73% of people were going to have pain. At least half were going to have fatigue, headache. Some people had muscle aches. And the reality is that some people had fevers up to 103, up to 104, transient fevers that were resolved by rest, Tylenol, and or ibuprofen. Some people actually had diarrhea and vomiting. And so these were all known side effects of a new vaccine. I think it's also important because people ask us, and I may be preempting a question that comes later, will I get sicker if I've already had COVID before and gotten the vaccine? The anecdotal response to that initially was yes. There's actually some data that came out in a pre-publication in Journal Watch earlier this week that actually showed that about 30 to 40% of people that have actually had COVID had more symptoms. But the exciting thing, they actually have a higher immune response as well, right? So there's a conversation that we can get into later about if you've already had COVID, maybe you need 1 shot. That's not the conversation for today, but we can do a Q&A about that later. When I talk about vaccine side effects, done HIV for 20 years, in the early HIV years with Kaletra and Dansine and a host of things, people got immensely sick, right? And we just pre-medicated them. I think it's important for people to understand that and, hey, have Tylenol or ibuprofen on hand. And again, if you compare the shingles vaccine to the Pfizer vaccine to the flu vaccine, you can see across the board. Shingles is a worse vaccine in terms of side effects, and the flu is better. It always is interesting, though, that the placebo, which is essentially normal saline, is the equivalent of the flu vaccine. And that's people that essentially got water into their body. So not to say that patients are interesting, but patients are interesting. I'm going to pivot to Moderna. Again, I think the colors are flipped, but again, you can see that efficacy line. The blue is those that didn't get it. The red is those that did. And again, I'll let Dr. Morse talk about this since he specifically was involved in this.
All right. So one point before I even discuss this, one point I want to make is that I want people to know, and so I want to clarify my role in this in the vaccine development process. So before phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials are trials in which people are receiving the vaccine. My area is the preclinical studies. These are the animal studies. These are the studies in which you have animals that are getting the same injections, same challenge. In challenge, essentially, you get vaccinated and you get challenged with the virus. And so what happens is I want to stress this, there are so many levels of protection that are between you and the vaccine that you're getting in your arm. So once again, it goes back to that Operation Warp Speed name. People are like, this is rushed. Nobody's looked at this. There are so many layers of protection between you, no matter how fast or how much faster it went this time, there are many layers between you and you getting a shot. And so in the animal studies, when I saw this, so I was literally one of the first people to see how effective this vaccine was in the animal model. And I was at my microscope, I sat back and I was in shock and I had to go back and look multiple times because I couldn't believe it, how effective it was in neutralizing the virus. And so when I took this information back to the group, it, moving forward, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that's when everything matched up. So it was not surprising that it was 95% protective in the human trials, because we saw how well it worked in animal models. So there are many, many layers, but we don't talk about that. There are many, many layers in between what you get and what is started in the laboratory setting. So I want to make sure that that is clear. And so this line that you see on here shows that you have a nice separation between the placebo group and those that were administered the vaccine. And so that's what you want to see. You don't want to see those lines together. You want to see them bifurcate and separate and go one way and one go the other, and preferably the vaccine staying low along the x-axis.
Absolutely. Hey, Dr. Moore, people
Yep.
always ask, well, will the vaccines protect you from transmitting? I think it's one of those yet to be determined pieces, but the Moderna trial actually had some data that I'm showing on the screen. Can you speak to that?
Right. Yeah. So exactly. So, I mean, the whole point is that we have shown with this vaccine that replication in the nasal passages was decreased or minimal in people that received the vaccine versus though in some cases. So that's why they're telling you, even if still be very careful about wearing your mask, about being around people, because you could be protected from an antibody response systemically, but you still could have virus in your nasal passages and your upper respiratory tract, and you could potentially pass that virus along to people around you, but you not get sick. So these are important facts that people need to know. Some people say, hey, I get my vaccine, I can go out and go party now. That's not the case. First and foremost, if you do get one vaccine, it still takes 12 to 14 days for you to generate an immune response that is protective. And I know that Dr. Alozzi later on is going to talk about protection versus one shot versus two shots, but you need to get that second shot. The second shot is what gives you that full protection, but still take those precautions in between that time frame.
Absolutely. And I think it's exciting to know that Moderna did this, and actually AstraZeneca released some information about transmission. And it also seems, although it's a different mechanism, to reduce transmission by about 2/3. So we'll have more of this information as the year goes by. First things first, though, people need to get their shot. And I think that's important. And so this is a graph that just sort of compares the two vaccines. These were the first two that we had, that the world really had. Pfizer versus Moderna. I think the biggest difference is in terms of cold storage, right? The Pfizer requires an ultra cold freezer as opposed to Moderna. Efficacy is the same. And so at the end of the day, it's really like the old Miller Lite battles, right? Is it taste great or is it less filling, right? And that's really what this is about. At the end of the day, they're both great vaccines. And I think it's important for people to sort of take that home. I'm going to briefly comment about some of the other vaccines that are not necessarily ready for prime time. There's an expectation that they will present their data to the FDA. Johnson & Johnson is actually prepared and has already given some prelim data to the FDA that'll go in this week, and then I think they're set for February 29th, if I'm not mistaken. The Novavax trial was in 2 phases. It was the UK trial. They had over 15,000 people, 18 to 84. Again, remember, all of these trials are essentially in 18 to 84, except for Pfizer, which is 16 to 84. The exciting thing about Novavax is, hey, it hit that bar of 50%. It went to 89.3%. But not just that, it's one of the vaccine trials that actually took part in South Africa, where they were having a large burden of transmission with the South African variant that we're getting concerned about, right? And so again, even then, it had 60% efficacy, and just as importantly, no hospitalizations and no deaths. We're going to have to start talking about that as a community, both as a lay community and a healthcare community, that the 95 top line, 89 top line, 72 that you're going to hear CNN and Fox and everybody else talk about is nice, but that may not be the actual issue. And so again, just kind of food for thought. When we mentioned Johnson & Johnson, many of you heard the Johnson & Johnson piece, and it was unfortunate. And I was actually really disappointed in the press that what they led with was 62% and 72%. Absolutely, that was the efficacy of the trial. Both the United States had the top line at 72, other areas, I think Brazil had 52. But I think what's really important, again, is 85% effective with severe disease, 100% effective at hospitalization and death. Also worked in South Africa. They had a raging pandemic and spread with the South African variant. And very important, especially for various parts of this country, when we talk about our supply chain, one shot. Not just one shot, normal refrigerator. So an organization or a community doesn't have to go and drop 20 grand on an ultra cold freezer. They can use the equipment they have. They can ensure, because you're on average going to have a drop off of 10 to 20% on the second shot. We're already seeing that in hospitals across Texas, for sure, in other parts of the country, that some people are not coming back. And so the totality of this conversation is going to be very important to how we ration and get supply out. I think the key thing is let's get vaccine out, let's get supply, because we're not going to have enough the way it is right now. And I'll mention AstraZeneca really briefly. Again, if you took anything away from the Moderna and the Pfizer, you realize that those lines were very different than this line. Those lines were wide open. These lines are a little bit closer, right? And there's a host of issues that AstraZeneca has had specifically because of a manufacturing issue. They gave half a dose, and it seemed as if the half dose actually worked more than the full dose. There seems to be actually some further analysis showing that it may not have been the half dose, but the fact that they took longer to give the second dose. And again, conversations that FDA and regulators and physicians will figure out over time. But looking at them side by side, sort of bluff, bottom line up front, you can see some of the differences. mRNA versus simian adenovirus. I hate the fact that they say it's chimpanzee. It's another of those Operation Warp Speed language things.
Right.
People are not going to want to take a chimpanzee thing, but if it's simian, sounds a lot cooler, just kind of food for thought. I think the efficacy of mRNA versus AstraZeneca at 62%. Again, that low dose group was 90%. And then there's just a couple of other things going on with it. And so they're going to submit data to the FDA, but they have to clean some of these things up before we get there. And so I think that's important. Again, I apologize for the quality of this. I took this from our colleague, Monica Gandhi at UCSF, did a great job of really outlining all the different vaccines that exist right now: Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, J&J, Novavax, and the Russian Sputnik, who actually released data in print this week. But I think the important thing here that I call out is it's amazing that we're here with potentially 6 vaccine candidates with a range of efficacy, and most likely it'll be a range of who gets it for various reasons, and we'll start to be able to tailor these vaccines. And I think that's immensely important. And if you're just one of those people that wants the bottom line numbers, these are the bottom line numbers for the ones that may come to the United States market. Overall efficacy for Pfizer and Moderna, approximately 95%. However, no data in South Africa. And if we're talking about South African and UK strains that may become the predominant strain in the United States over the spring and summer, that's going to need to be a question. And so again, Ian's group and other groups are already looking at boosters, and we can talk about that a little bit at the end. But I think that's really where I'm going to end that as we go to the next stage. Dr. Moore, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're covering it, man. I want to tell everybody who's watching this, you probably won't get a presentation this clear and statistically solid anywhere else. And I have been working with this vaccine since, like I said, since February, and there are a number of people who are experts in the field. I'm going to tell you right now, Dr. Lozzi is laying this out for you like a red carpet. All you have to do is walk the walk and get to the other end and get your vaccine. So I want to give you a big, applause in the middle of this presentation, because this is extremely solid, well planned, well put together. So I appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, man. All right, I'm going to pivot to distribution, and we're going to talk about some hurdles ahead. I'm not going to belabor the distribution, but I think it's important for people to understand this is not a United States of America problem. This is a global problem. There are billions of people on this planet, 7 to 8 billion, depending on whose numbers you want to take. And you can see already when you talk about the governments that are trying to secure vaccine, India has 1.6 billion. The European Union has 1.4 billion. The United States has 1.01 billion. It's called a billion. And remember, all of those are secured vaccine that you have to cut in half to get the number of people that it will affect, right? So these are secured 500,000 people. The problem is we put most of our eggs in the AstraZeneca basket. Understandable from a policy standpoint, because they had some of the earliest data earlier this summer. Right? However, it's still not available to the United States. And so between Moderna, which has actually been upped to about 250 million now, and then the Pfizer at 100 million, that only gets us to 150 to 160 million people potentially vaccinated. And so those are some of the concerns, and those are some of the key reasons that we're going to need Johnson & Johnson. We're going to need AstraZeneca. We're going to need Novavax to really get vaccination across the board. You may have heard, and hopefully you've seen this, what the rollout is supposed to look like, the so-called 1A, B, C, and phase 2. I think it's important to really understand that this was controversial, but I think it's based on risk. And so healthcare workers were put up front, but not just healthcare workers, but the people that had the largest burden of disease in the United States, persons living in long-term care facilities, nursing homes and such, right? We're still struggling with that, but to get vaccine in arms, a lot of organizations, a lot of states, Texas is one, has said, hey, we're going to continue to focus on our healthcare workers, but we're also going to give 18 to 65 if they have two comorbid conditions, right? And so different states will be allowed to do different things. I think the important thing is to get vaccine in arm. I'm going to share something, and we're going to use you, Miss Johnson. I know you're writing questions because I can see them on my peripheral vision coming in fast or furious. So I'm going to assume, Miss Johnson, that you're 40. Let's say you're 40. What county do you live in?
I am proud to be 45, sir, and I live in Fort Bend County in Texas.
All right, Fort
I
Bend.
thought you were 35.
I think I'm 25. If my brother on the line, he gonna say, "What are you talking about? You're only 25."
I didn't want to go down that trap. So all right. So you're not a healthcare worker. And the other things, COVID-related risk factors, I will assume no. I'm going to hit submit. And you can see, and New York Times did a great job of this. You are down. Whoa, you're way down. You're all the way down here, right? And so, but this is a reasonable assessment of how many people are trying to get this vaccine. It says it right here. When it comes to Texas, you're behind 24.4 million people who are at a higher risk. And in Fort Bend, you're behind approximately 500,000 people. And so when people say, why can't we do better? Why can't we do more? The reality is we're resource constrained. We don't have enough vaccine. And there's millions of people who, if they get COVID, can die, right? And so again, you've heard the politics about people that have access, people that have money, getting access to these vaccines. I think there's a different conversation about equity, and it's disappointing that we potentially failed again and how we are attribute equity and equality in healthcare. But that's a longer conversation for another day that I can't fix today. When we sort of think about concerns, I'm a Douglas Adams guy, and so it's life, the universe, and everything. I will say this. In 2020, we did 4 big things that required really complex communication skills, right? Required communication, trust, and logistics. We essentially screwed up on 3 of them. We screwed up masks. We didn't get the mask conversation out on time. We screwed up PPE because we didn't believe that PPE was important. And I truly believe we should have used the Defense Production Act to get it out there faster. And we screwed up on testing. We wasted months and months trying to figure out whether we should test, who's testing, is it too much, positivity rate, all these things that if we had just gotten the damn tests into people's hands, we could have protected some of our most vulnerable, right? But you can understand, however, why there's lack of trust. And we need to rebuild trust in the medical system, right? Because people still do trust the people that are in the healthcare community to give them the right numbers. Oops, sorry, I missed one. And so what we need to do, and it's interesting, what we probably did well, irrespective of what side of the political line you stand on, was voting. We had more people vote than ever in the history of this country. It doesn't matter who won. The fact is that we got that right. And we need to use that same vigor and communication and empathy around getting people vaccine. And again, part of the problem is this, right? And you can read the cartoon and I'll voice it over, but you hear it all the time. Today, we're going to discuss a controversial topic. Caller 1, you're here to give the facts on the topic, but display no emotions. That would be Dr. Moore. Yes, I'll be reasonable. Caller 2, you're here to argue with caller 1 emotionally, but give no real facts. Buckle in for some mad rants. And who's the winner in this? It's the press, right? The cartoon on the other side. Next up, we'll discuss the topic with someone whose job is to be a well-researched and respected expert in the area. And in the interest of balance, we'll also talk to an idiot. I feel like that all the time for the amount of time that I have spent in media rooms and all these other conversations. And I understand reasonable people can disagree, but there are some things that people disagree upon that are not reasonable. And we got to call a spade a spade. We got to call a lie. And we have to tell people when science drives a decision. And science doesn't drive every decision, right? So I think that's also important for people to understand. You can then realize, and this is back in September, why there was so much hesitancy, why there's so much vaccine hesitancy. You look at the communities of color, right? Hispanic, Black. This was back in September. The Kaiser Foundation did a more recent one about a month ago, and you can still see that about 27%, this middle blue line, is still hesitant to take this vaccine, with African Americans being around 35%. The good thing is that since this rollout, it's actually started to trend better, right? So I think that's immensely important. People like Dr. Moore, others in this space that have continued to give that messaging out, YWCA and other organizations, spoke with the Baptist Health community in Nebraska some months ago, all focused on giving out this information, because if we fail our communities of color, we're already predominantly affected by this. It only gets worse, from school to economics to a whole host of things. I think that's important. One of the things that people ask all the time when they talk.
Dr. Lozzi.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, after this, can you ask Ian to compound it, like tell his history and where he graduated from and why there may be a little bit more of hesitation with the Black community and communities of color to want to.
Right now, Dr. Moore, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. All right. Sorry about that. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Yeah. No, I will actually. This probably is a good time to talk about it. If you can go back one slide, Dr. Lozzi.
Right there.
Yep. There you go. So notice that 53%. You know, that in general, if you look at by gender at the top, these are people who are extremely or very likely to take it. And then you have the groups who are not likely to take it. And so if you look at the group of in Black and Hispanic and white, 37% of Black people right now, based on this chart, are not likely to get it. And so I think that in itself, I mean, I definitely want us to get to that and talk about that. But for me, I grew up in Alabama in a rural area. I went to Tuskegee University. And so I was actually at Tuskegee during the time in which they established the Bioethics Center. That's when Bill Clinton made the public apology for the syphilis experiment at Tuskegee. And so I have a very special understanding of this process because I was there. And as a student at Tuskegee, you learn certain things about the campus. When you first get there, you read Up From Slavery. That's a book that you have to read as a requirement as a Tuskegee student. But as also being there, you learn about the history of the campus, you learn about the school. And that was one of the uglier aspects of how the country took advantage of these Black men in this community, essentially allowing them to go untreated with syphilis and then go back and spread it in the community. And it was called the natural progression of syphilis in the Negro man. And so that is, that's a really bad stain. But with that being said, I want everybody on this call to recognize the fact that that was a different time. It's a good lesson, but it is very much a different time because there are people that look like me. As a matter of fact, if you are not familiar with it, one of the lead scientists in the development of this vaccine, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, 34-year-old brilliant Black woman, is the person who's at the top of the chain leading this effort. I speak to her on a weekly basis and we talk about this, but then I'm able to watch it at the preclinical level. So there's a difference in this vaccine. So there's, people have conspiracy theories, but there's no nefarious, nobody's trying their best to, poison people or get rid of people and all that kind of stuff. And just to be completely honest, I've heard a lot of conspiracy theories. I've heard people say, well, they're just trying to get rid of Black folks. They're trying to, there are lots of thoughts, but if there were a need or a desire to, it wouldn't be vaccines. There'd probably be blood pressure medications or diabetes medications, because those are the things that we sometimes are most afflicted by. So don't let somebody try to dissuade you from taking this vaccine. This vaccine is going to protect you and keep you safe. And so I do want to make sure that people understand that. I want to make people understand that we are a part of the team now. We are part of the team. We are at the table and we are making sure that it's safe, not just for you, but for everybody. And so we want you to have confidence when you go and take these vaccines. But but I don't want to harp on that too much. So I'm losing focus here. So I'm sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and give it back to Dr. Alozie. But that is the point though. So don't focus on the facts of the vaccine and know that we are in the chain of the process. And so there's nothing from that perspective that another Tuskegee experiment is not going to happen, because we are here and we are involved and we care about us as much as we care about anybody else.
Absolutely. I think that's a critical piece, right? You can't have a conversation about us without us. And people like you and others are now in the process. They're at the table. And so I think that is a huge difference from the Tuskegee era to now. So I appreciate that, Dr. Moore. That's immense. I'm going to speed past because I know I'm already going over time. But I think one of the things about side effects that people have asked is, well, what happens when I've had a severe reaction before? I think, again, that's a conversation to have with your physician or your clinician. That was part of the exclusion criteria in the trials, history of severe adverse reaction associated with the vaccine. And again, like Dr. Moore mentioned, a lot of this is about the language and how do you communicate with people, right? Again, we failed several times in 2020 on communication. And I put this out there because it's funny more than anything else, but I assure you this, if we knew that COVID could cause erectile dysfunction, there's so many people that would have worn a mask early. There's so many people that would have gone to get this damn vaccine without any conversation, right? Because it would have been driven by men who are predominantly policymakers and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which side you're on, rule the budgets of these things. Again, tongue in cheek, it's kind of funny, but I think it's just out there. One of the last sort of pieces I round up is that reminder and sort of buttressing what Dr. Moore said around, because you get the vaccine doesn't mean it's time to go buck wild, right? There's a host of things that we have done and failed to do in the process of this pandemic, from staying at home, wearing masks, hand hygiene, avoid touching your face, if in a crowd, limit the time, and then the government, society, companies sort of failed to do other things. Testing and tracing, that didn't work very well. Ventilation in older buildings, especially in some of our schools, concerning. The financial support that people need, if they're going to be told to stay at home, they can't stay at home and pay their bills with water. And so they need that support, right? Quarantine and isolation. Where do you quarantine and where do you go? I've done some work in the Navajo Nation, and it was amazing to me how in those homes and in multiple homes across the country, especially in the South, when you have multi-generational homes with a child, teenager, adult, and an elderly person all in the same household, how do you quarantine? How do you quarantine in 1,500 square feet when all those people are in the same place? Vaccines is that sort of last piece of the Swiss cheese model that will hopefully allow us to get to, as Ms. Johnson said in the beginning, back to whatever normal is going to be. And we can talk about normal. But it's important to people remember those 4 keys that Atul Gawande talked about early on in this pandemic: wash your hands, watch your symptoms, wear a mask, and watch your distance, are still going to become critical. We still need to, however, and I'm really adamant about this going forward, we still have to give people that conversation around hope. We can't tell people to go get a vaccine if everything's going to be the same way it was for the rest of their lives. That doesn't provide hope. The vaccine has to be this pathway out. The vaccine has to also remind them that, hey, yes, you can, like me, get COVID and survive. You can have a long list of other symptoms that could affect you for months and years to come. I still can be sitting and I'll look at my watch and I'll be like, oh, wow, 130, I'm not doing anything. Yep, 130 about an hour ago, doing absolutely nothing, right? So you don't want to get COVID. That's not the pathway out that we want to take, and vaccines provide that hope. And so those shots in the arm are critically important. We haven't talked about this specifically, but I'll jump to it because herd immunity is really what vaccines are supposed to do. And so this is why it's so important for policymakers and healthcare workers and healthcare decision makers and people to understand why vaccines are important. You can see this slide right here, and it says, if we were to give 1.5 million people vaccine a day, to get to 80% immunity, it would take to December 24th. Right? That's why they're trying to get more and more. It changes if we get this to, let's say, 70%. But only to November 10th. if you really want to make a change, and this is where some controversy is going to come in policies over the next few months, is do you go to one shot that gets us to July 2nd, right? Or do you vaccinate people like me that have already gotten the vaccine, shortens it by a month? But the key decider in these variables is one shot versus two. And so that data that's come out recently about people who have already been infected having up to 10 times as much immunity may start to play into policymakers. And so again, conversations for future, but I think it's important to understand where we're going with this. And so this is an arms race to get as many shots into people as possible. We want to be vaccinated. We don't know if there'll be a vaccine passport or not. My guess is at some point, various organizations and locations may say, hey, you don't get to come into my restaurant if you're not vaccinated. You don't get to come on this plane if you're not vaccinated. You don't get to go watch Usher in Vegas if you're not vaccinated, and it'll be tracked somehow by your phone. And so I think all those are very important things. Again, to close, another sort of summary of all the things that are going on. Again, not to belabor this, I'll send it off. I will say two more things in closing. May we never again take for granted Friday nights with friends, those birthday celebrations, the roar of a stadium, mornings at the gym, a packed dance floor, coffee with a friend, crowded Usher concerts, happy hour, or life itself. Amen. And just as importantly, nothing should go back to normal. Normal wasn't working. If we go back to the way things were, we would have lost the lesson. May we rise up and do better to be better. 2020 was all about masking. 2021 should be about masking and vaccinations. Dr. Moore, I'll let you take it home.
All right. I want to just, say thank you for that. I want to make an absolute, use this last few minutes to make an absolute plea to the people who are watching this presentation. People have a lot of, people risk a lot of things. Risk is every day. Every day you walk out the house is a risk. If you were at my house right now and you're getting ready to go home, I would say, hey, give me a call when you get home. I say that because I know that something could potentially happen when you leave the house. If it's raining outside, I say, hey, you want my umbrella or you need a jacket? Because it's raining, you need to protect yourself from getting wet. This vaccine is no different. I know that's a very simplistic explanation, but this vaccine is no different. The question is, there's vaccine hesitancy. Are you hesitant because you think the vaccine will hurt you? If you are, then the question is, which one do you want to bank on more? A virus that is literally filling up morgues? Or do you want to risk a potential side effect, a mild side effect that has been reported? Because once again, people are saying, I want to wait and see what happens to other people. That's where the clinical trials come in. So that has been assessed. We've with this vaccine in particular, with the Moderna vaccine, 15,000 people were given this vaccine. And those 15,000 people are still going. None of those people have had any severe, any issues. And so that's kind of the point. So do you want to gamble on how, because the other part of it is that getting infected, there are people who have mild disease. There are people who are on ventilators. You don't want to gamble and find out where you fall in that spectrum of disease, especially if you have a pre-existing condition. So with that being said, I received the vaccine. So I'm not one of those people saying, hey, because I've had that question, hey, go get a vaccine. And the question is, well, have you been vaccinated? I sure have. I've been vaccinated. My wife has been vaccinated. And let me, I know you don't know it, but I talked to my mom into getting a vaccine. If I had my mom get a vaccine, anybody can get a vaccine. My mom, she wasn't scared. She just doesn't like vaccines, period. But she knew, I explained to her, I said, the benefits of protection versus the risk of severe disease, you don't want to risk those things. And so for the people who are hearing this message, you absolutely need to go forward, get your vaccine and at this point now, it's kind of hard to even get vaccine because there is such a shortage now because certain states are not getting as much as they were supposed to get in the first place. So don't wait. If you get an opportunity, I would have taken Pfizer. I would have taken any of those vaccines that are approved. I just took the Moderna vaccine because it was offered to us as an NIH employee. So I took it, but if I hadn't had to get the Pfizer vaccine, you better believe I would have taken it. So I want people to understand that. I'm not on a soapbox just talking down. I took the vaccine myself. I experienced soreness. That's it. My second dose is coming this week, actually. So for those people who are listening, get your vaccine. It is safe. It is effective. protect yourself from unnecessary hurt, harm, and danger. And with that, I'm gonna let Dr. Alozi do the benediction.
I appreciate it, man.
No, we won't be done unless you guys.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
I would also like
He was tongue-in-cheeking it.
Yeah, Dr. Alozi, can you share your experience with being COVID positive?
Yeah, COVID sucks. I mean, here's the thing. I thank God that I did not end up, as I sort of like to call it, upside down, on a ventilator in an ICU somewhere. I think that COVID is just something you want to avoid, right? I mean, I felt fatigued. I was generally good up until the time I found out. And actually, I took what's called the monoclonal antibody infusion because I'd gotten kind of fluffy in 2020. And so I actually met the BMI criteria. And so the antibody infusion made me sicker than the actual virus. I had a headache for 5 weeks. I had one of the worst headaches of my life. And so I can't get vaccinated for at least 90 days until that antibody sort of wears out of my system, so it doesn't blunt my immune response. But I mean, as you know, Ms. Johnson, I mean, I've been a proponent of the vaccine in my community and communities of color everywhere I go, doing some work in Nigeria soon as well. And so, I mean, this is not local, national, countrywide. It's an international issue, and each of us in our various communities, and I overlap in multiple communities, being born in Nigeria but grew up in Minnesota. I'm gonna fight and push and prod and cajole and threaten people to get the vaccine as much as possible, and they can at me as much as they can. Well, that's the only way that we're going to get back to any semblance of normalcy.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have plenty of questions.
I can imagine.
I sent you all some questions in the beginning. Yesterday, so you guys can prepare for them. I think you handled most of those. So I am going to begin to ask questions. And if these are your questions and you want to come off chat to expound on them, please feel free. So this is a question from Safa Muhammad. Are there a lot of confirmed med cases of catching the COVID-19 after vaccines? If so, what are some discussed reasons?
Well, I think I kind of know what the question is there, and then I'm gonna let Dr. Alozi, same thing, play by play. I'm gonna let you finish it up because you're the clinical person. I have heard of a couple of rare cases of people being infected after vaccination, but there's a very important detail in that. People who are getting vaccinated, once again, that's why I stressed earlier, if you are being vaccinated or if you've been vaccinated, you still need to take precaution and wear your mask, still socially distance, because what happens is you still need a time frame. There's a time frame. You can get vaccinated tomorrow and you can get COVID the day after, because what happens is your body needs 12 to 14 days at minimum to generate antibodies that are protective. And even if that is the case, that protection level is lower than it would be if you had your second dose. So in between shots and doses, you need to, at least 2 to 3 weeks after, you still need to take those precautions, and you need to do it even after. It's more of a social, kind of a social representation at that point. Wearing your mask is you're setting a good model for other people to wear their masks. So don't just start taking your mask off because now you've been vaccinated, but you potentially could get infected if you've been vaccinated, if you have not yet gotten the correct antibody response that you need. So I'll let Dr. Alozi take that from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it all. The key is, if you've gotten it before, still get vaccinated. There's a chance that you could get vaccinated. More importantly, there's a chance that you could have carriage, right? The immune response driven by the vaccine seems to reduce transmission, right? And so I think that really becomes the key. I mean, we can have a conversation about in a resource poor area where you're trying to make a decision between, you have a community like some places in Florida, the villages in Florida, right? 40 to 50% of their population above the age of 65. I probably wouldn't vaccinate people in that community that have already had it first, because limited supply of vaccine, I'm going to vaccine all the over 65, because those are the ones that have the highest risk of death and mortality and morbidity, and then sort of trickle it back. But again, great question.
Okay. This one is from Tracy Murray. Once you're vaccinated, is there still a need to quarantine after traveling or being exposed to positive cases? And if so, is it the normal time between 10 to 14 days or no?
I think around let's talk about the Swiss cheese, right? So we use that. I think all those pieces of the Swiss cheese do not change just because you've been vaccinated. I mean, here's what I feel comfortable telling people that have been vaccinated. If you have people that are vaccinated 14 days post second dose, I truly don't believe they need to have those precautions, right? The data stands up to that. The problem is, and this is again where that sort of healthcare equity comes into play. Most people haven't been vaccinated, right? So who is vaccinated? You don't have a passport. There's no app. There's no scarlet letter on your head, right? That says, "Hey, I've been vaccinated." They don't put a V for vendetta or vaccination on your scalp. So again, you have to be careful. And I think it's important to continue the message because it doesn't do any good if we have a quarter of the population vaccinated and 75% isn't, and then they let down their guards as well. And then variants, that's how variants are created, right? If you have a pool of unvaccinated people running wild with multiplying virus. And so I think that's just important for people to understand. Again, the world will change. It will get better. It is likely that this is going to be endemic and come out in hot spots here and then. We can argue about whether a booster is yearly or seasonally, whatever the case is. I think we just got to get through now, right? So step by step.
To that same point, I think you mentioned a really important point, something that we haven't talked about in depth, but variants. These variants are circulating, and variants are created when the virus is allowed to continually replicate. So that's actually where the push for getting vaccinated comes in. It's really important to get vaccinated because the more opportunity that this virus has to replicate, the more opportunity it has to create variants. And I could go into the details of how variants are created, but just imagine this. When a virus replicates, in theory, it replicates and just makes itself and keeps going. But there is a space in there for error. It's an error in replication. So what happens is, in some cases, the error can cause the virus to be weaker, and that's not a very good variant. But a variant in which an error occurs, and that error could change something in the virus that allows it to be more transmissible. Like the concern is for the UK strains and the South Africa strain. The error allows the virus to be stronger and to be more easily transmissible. So with that being said, I will say that the one cool thing, and I'm not pubbing any particular vaccine in this case, but what I will tell you is that, let's say, for example, because those studies are going on right now to see how effective mRNA, in particular Moderna, is against the South Africa strain. But what I will tell you is that if you have a South Africa strain, the cool thing about the mRNA technology is that if there was a situation where, let's say, that vaccine didn't work against the South Africa strain, the technology allows you to be a sequence from that South Africa strain, specifically from that South Africa strain, and take that and use the same technology to create a booster. And you get injected with a booster that gives you antibodies to protect you specifically against that. And that can happen within a matter of probably even months, because the technology is so plastic. It can be changed so quickly. So there is so much hope in mRNA vaccine technology. So even if the South Africa strain is able to avoid vaccination, which it is not known just yet, then it could be essentially, the vaccine could be designed or redesigned to address that particular concern. So we have a lot of hope to rest upon as well, but you have to get vaccinated. Some protection is better than no protection.
Okay. And I also want to let everyone know, if you have to drop off, feel free to drop off. This is the Q&A section. Thank you for participating. If you do have to drop off, this will be posted because it was recorded, and you can contact myself, Dory, Ty, and we can always put you in contact with the physician. So if you have to drop off, feel free to drop off. The next question is from Diana Dorantes, and it's kind of in line with what you just talked about, Dr. Moore. With the Moderna and Pfizer, would it still provide some type of protection and she was just talking about the new UK strand, that she skimmed the article from ABC where they stated the UK strand was more deadly and more contagious, and even a mask won't help. So I guess when will you have some information on that? But you just sort of answered
Yeah.
that. But do you have any?
Those studies are ongoing right now. But as I mentioned, there is hope in the sense that if there is evidence that something wasn't protective, it could be changed pretty quickly. The other thing is having a vaccine on board, because there is still a thought and there's a thought in the process that these vaccines are probably going to provide you some protection. And especially when you start with 95% efficacy, you have a little bit of a pillow, a little bit of a cushion to come down to 70%, 60% or whatever, where some of the vaccines currently are. So with those vaccines being so efficacious, then you have, there's a lot of room there for the vaccine to still be able to protect you. But the specifics of those studies are ongoing right now. And so, it is our hope that people will still get vaccinated, because you still need to have some antibodies circulating, because while you're worried about South Africa, there's still the traditional wild type WASH1 strain that's circulating, the one that we've all been, hiding from. That's still circulating. So you can wait for South Africa and wonder about that while you still have to deal with the one that's circulating right now. So get your vaccine and be protected. And if you need a booster, you need a booster, and that could come down the road.
Okay. This is from, I'm not really sure who this came from, but it was sent in. In the news, it came out that people who previously had COVID had serious negative results from the second shot. This kind of falls in line with, if you had COVID, if you're getting the Moderna or the Pfizer, do you need both of the shots in the series, or can you just get one because you've been infected and then you just get the booster with the first shot? So the negative results from, or I guess she's saying negative side effects from the second shot. Can you speak to that, or Dr. Alozi, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'll just sort of talk about like I said, there was something that was published this week. It's in pre-peer review, but it did show that people that had had it previously seemed to have more side effects. Actually, if you think about it, it's not something that is surprising globally. And so, yeah, they did seem to have more side effects. They also seem to have a lot more antibody production, right? So again, I think the conversation that person may be asking about whether they should get one shot or two, I think it's still too early. The guidance and the data is 2 shots. Get your 2 shots. You may not feel great after the second one or even after the first one, but none of these side effects are things that are concerning. And again, it sounds flippant when I say it, but if your concern is side effects of a vaccine that will protect you from death, being upside down on a ventilator in my ICU, I know what the easy piece is. I let people make their own decision around that.
And on that same note, to clarify, when it comes to side effects are not a bad thing. The severity of side effects is where the question comes in. But having a side effect means that you're having an immune response. So when you get a set, because I know it's coming. So my vaccine is, my second dose is coming this week, and I'm taking that day off because I already know that I have a chance of probably feeling. And when I say side effect, I mean headache, chills, fever. I will take that any day versus compared to, some of the things that I have personal friends of mine, family of mine who have been sick. I almost want to share one story, but it is so morbid that, I'll share it. I had a friend of mine who got sick. And in a conversation, he's a fairly stoic person. He told me at one point in time, and I talked to his niece, but he expressed to his niece that he was in such pain with COVID. Now his wife had to isolate from him. He was in a room. He was in such pain. He said that he didn't know what he would do if he were near a firearm. That's the situation you're dealing with. Don't know where on that spectrum you fall, and you don't want to find out. but he was in such intense pain and he did not know what he was going to do if he had the options of taking his own life into his hands. And so when you have situations like that coming from people who you know are very stoic, very, very tough, then you know that this is a very serious situation. So I don't want anybody to have to experience that, because I have seen many people experience it. And I know that Dr. Alozzi has seen it on a whole different level, especially being in the El Paso area, because El Paso was on the news months ago for very, very high rates of death and severe disease. So don't gamble with your life over somebody spreading a rumor about a vaccine. This vaccine is safe, and you're getting it once again from people who know about the vaccine and have taken it. I've taken it, and I'm getting ready to take my second one. So go ahead, get your vaccine, protect yourself, and set a good example for your family as well.
Yeah, and in that line, I mean, because I see a question here that's talking about side effects. Somebody was asking about the neurological side effects. I think it's important to understand that, and people forget about this a lot, but I'll sort of break it down. I think in the United States, minus COVID, cancer and cardiovascular are the top two causes of death globally. People need to understand, people are going to keep on dying of cancer and heart disease. They're going to get vaccine. And then what's going to happen is that people will say, well, the vaccine gave them cancer. The vaccine gave them heart disease. There's always going to be death. There's always going to be people that had Bell's palsy, to specifically talk to this question. The background rate of Bell's palsy is about 20 to 25 per 10,000. The background rate for the vaccine was 1 per 10,000, right? So we're talking about multitudes less. There's no evidence that any of these vaccines causes Bell palsy. And so, again, I think it's important for people to understand that the vaccine may have happened to somebody that was going to die, as opposed to the vaccine causing death or causing illness. And I think those are all very important things to sort of think about, but just kind of food for thought.
Okay. I know one that came in before, and I'm not sure. I would like for it to be touched on because I received it a couple of times. Why are type 2 diabetics more affected differently or impacted more severely than, people who don't have diabetes? I know you touched on that the last time. If you could just give that breakdown again.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to understand. And again, one of the things that we don't take into account as often as we do is that medical science and the understanding of medical science is a constant process. But we as human beings are not used to things changing that rapidly, right? We are used to what we're used to. We drive to work a certain way. We put on our clothes in a certain way, right? We wear certain colors. We have certain foods. And so we don't like to be told, well, drive to work 10 different ways over the next 10 days, or wear 10 different colors when your favorite color is black, right? People need to also understand that science changes rapidly. In the beginning, we thought COVID and the virus was a pulmonary disease. We thought it affected the lungs because it was and people were short of breath. What we've come to realize over time is it's a multi-system vascular disease. It affects the blood, which is why people get clots. People get clots in their lungs, liver, wherever it may be. They have the mottling or the darkening colors of their fingers and toes, the so-called COVID joints. And so one of the things that people need to also realize is that diabetes as a disease is a disastrous condition. The sugar that accumulates in your blood or rises in a level in your blood causes damage to the big vessels, your heart attack vessels, and the tiny vessels that go into your fingers and toes and your kidneys and can cause erectile dysfunction. So when you take diabetes as a baseline, and uncontrolled diabetes, unfortunately, then you layer COVID on top of it, it's a disaster. Similar with obesity. The larger you are, you may not be diabetic, but obesity on its own leads to something called insulin resistance, which is early diabetes. We don't know about it. We don't talk about it because we don't test it on average as much as we can. So diabetes as a risk factor is horrendous. I would actually say it's one of the worst risk factors on top of age and obesity for death and morbidity for COVID. And so I think we've been talking about COVID and vaccines, but I think it's just important to have a conversation about if you don't have a physician, get to a physician, get to a clinician, have a primary care assessment once a year, twice a year, because you never know. There's so many people that I've seen in the hospital in this last year that got their diagnosis of diabetes in the hospital, right? First time ever, they had no idea. They were walking around or they had symptoms, but they didn't want to go to the hospital. So again, I think that's important for people to understand.
Okay.
Can I speak to a question, Chaz, that I saw?
Yes, you
There's been a
can.
couple of them about women and pregnancy and kids. And
Yes.
so I'll sort of take them all together. I'll break them apart. In the studies, and Dr. Moore can chime in as well, pregnant women were not specifically identified as a risk group for a host of reasons that we do the ethics of healthcare and clinical studies globally. On average, that's normal, right? From HIV or hepatitis C, we don't go out and look for pregnant women to do those trials on because of the risk potentially to the mother and the baby, on average, right? There's some exceptions to that. And so what happens post trial is that we'll now look backwards in either a consensus group or over the years, various pregnancy registries are set up and they will start to say, hey, we've seen X, Y, or Z, and that develops over time. From a COVID vaccine standpoint, even though they were not in the trials, all the obstetric guidelines across the country have come together to say the risk of COVID is a larger risk than we believe the risk of vaccination is, right? And so that's really what has driven that piece. The second part, and I think you saw it as we sort of broke down the various trials, was it was 18 to 64 deliberately. And I think Pfizer was 16 to, I said 64, 84. Pfizer was a little bit younger, but again, the same reason, we don't deliberately go and test kids unless we're doing cancer chemotherapy or a host of diseases, sickle cell, whatever that they have. In saying that, and this is where I'll pivot from science a little bit and go off on a limb, I think that those trials are getting done now. If I'm not mistaken, Dr. Moore, Moderna's either fully registered or is about to be. Pfizer is about to be fully registered. But I think it's also important as we sort of look at 2020, what we've learned when we've stepped aside from the fear is that the data really does show that kids neither get as sick with COVID-19, even when they have it. They're not as efficient transmitters as adults. And so, and we protected kids immensely in the beginning by not sending them to school. What unfortunately this has turned into is a socioeconomic classroom science project. Because those of you that have kids in private schools, hey, kids are in schools and there's no evidence across the country that they're hotspots. Those of you that have kids in public schools, depending on where you live, have not had that ability. And so from a personal one-on-one standpoint, kids are losing. Those that don't have food security, those that don't have internet security. The trials need to be done and they will be done because people want the data. But I think it's also fair from an equity standpoint that the goal was to help people not die. And again, it's morbid, but the reality is this: less kids have died from COVID in 2020 than died from the influenza the year before. And so I think that's very important for people to understand when you take context. Dr. Moore?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I do know that, both Moderna and Pfizer are looking at children right now. I think Pfizer was actually one of the first ones to start looking at the vaccine in kids as young as 12. And so I think they're starting that right now. But there are, and as Dr. Alozi said, I mean, there are reports of kids getting sick, and probably a little bit more now. And I think a lot of it is because kids are being forced, especially maybe in public school settings, being forced back into schools in large groups. There is still not the same degree that we have in adults, but there's a condition right now called, it's the abbreviation is MIS-C. It's like a multisystemic inflammatory syndrome in children. And so kids are having some issues, but if you think about it, if you crowd kids into schools, especially in public school settings, there's an opportunity for kids to get sick. Now, do they get as sick as adults? Not typically, but then, just like adults, some kids have some underlying conditions. Some kids might have juvenile diabetes or something like that. So you have to keep all these things in mind and keep them in front of you when you're considering whether or not you send your kids back to school. I have 2 kids right now, and they're completely 100% doing virtual school right now, and they've been doing that since probably, I don't know, March maybe, and so, or March of last year. And so for me, I think I'm happy with them being home as much as I would want them, but it just means more effort on my part. It means more effort on my part to make sure I fill in gaps when it comes to, I'm way more, I was involved anyway, but I'm way more involved. If they're on a call, I'm taking notes and making sure that after we get through, we can, so you have to adapt. The overarching point here is that we are in a pandemic. So that is the other side of it. A lot of people look at a pandemic as it's somehow the pandemic in itself is bothering me. You're in the middle of a pandemic. You are in a pandemic, and I have to come back to that because we have people who are pushing for a lot of activities and doing a lot of things. And man, I want to travel. This is a pandemic. A pandemic shuts the world down. A pandemic affects every corner of the world. So we have to respond accordingly. And that means sometimes being in situations where we don't have everything we want. We can't do everything we want to. So it is a situation where we have to bunker down, put our heads down, and do things that we may not like to do. Wearing a mask, staying away from grandma and grandpa, whoever, Mama and Big Mom, because I know, I call my grandmother Big Mom. So you got to stay away from those people. And it's not, I saw a video not too long ago of a lady getting on a plane, getting ready to go fly during Thanksgiving to go see her grandparents. And the reporter asked her, like, are you concerned? She was like, no, she said, because I've been taking my precautions, and I can't imagine not seeing them for Thanksgiving. That's exactly what she said. But the question is, you going to visit for Thanksgiving might mean that they're not there for Christmas. So just keep those things in mind when we're doing these things, is that it is not meant to be comfortable. A pandemic is stressful. A pandemic is difficult.
Yeah, I just heard here in Houston, it's like maybe 30% of the students in high school are failing a class, at least one class. So it's impacting everyone at different rates. I know we have our Boys and Girls Clubs are like hot spots for the children who don't have internet access. Mm-hmm. But my daughter is back in school full time. But I mean, we get those emails all the time, and it's a process for you to go to school now. You don't just drop your kid off at school. You got to walk them in. You got to show the little screening. They got to take the temperature, give a sticker. You can't go in. So yeah, things are a lot different now. But,
yeah.
Absolutely. We have some things about allergies. Being allergic to cats and dogs. But I don't think that's a contraindication, but can you speak to the contraindication for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, if they have like EpiPen, severe allergic reactions to things? Can you talk about that a little?
I'll speak from my experience of when I went and got my vaccine, for example. The first thing they do ask you is that whether or not you have had any, do you have any food allergies? Are you prescribed a EpiPen? Or they'll ask you, have you had any previous reactions, severe reactions to, or anaphylaxis to vaccinations before? And so if you have not, what they're doing in pretty much every place they're vaccinating now, 15 minutes after you get your vaccine, if you don't have a history of any allergic reaction, you can actually stay for 15 minutes and you sit down after you've been vaccinated, and they essentially watch you. And it makes sense. I mean, we do that. I mean, as a veterinarian, you do that when you vaccinate an animal. You go and let it, you tell the owner and the dog to sit in the waiting room until, 15 minutes or so, just to make sure, and then you send them on their way. So, but if you have a history of food allergy or severe food allergies, or if you're prescribed the EpiPen, or you have a history of previous anaphylaxis to a vaccine, then they actually tell you to either wait 30 minutes, they have you wait 30 minutes, or I would even suggest taking your EpiPen with you. Because once again, the risk of you and the possibility of you having an anaphylactic reaction, while it is real, it is minimal compared to the fact of you getting COVID and potentially not surviving. So once again, it's about being uncomfortable for a second, potentially uncomfortable, or being alive. And those are the two comparisons that people need to make. And so but I'll let Dr. Aluzzi talk to that, because he's the clinical person. So go right ahead.
I mean, I think you did it great, right? I mean, you identified all of them. I think the other thing is the data, right? As of a couple of weeks ago, we had 2.5 million people vaccinated. There were 4 reported cases of an anaphylactic reaction. That's 4 out of 2.5 million. So again, in the initial weeks, there was a concern about that. But now that we've vaccinated people that have anaphylactic reactions, that have an EpiPen, and 4 out of 2.5 million, like you said, most organizations are taking that 15 minutes. They ask you for the screening, take your EpiPen if you've had it. But what I call run-of-the-mill allergies to plants and dogs and dander and things like that, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about allergies and reactions to the COVID vaccine. Since I'm in El Paso and I can see that somebody asked a question about El Paso, I'll answer that. The question says, there's a concern in El Paso about not receiving second doses in time. Do you know the efficacy of 1 dose and how long it lasts? I think a couple of things, and Dr. Moore, they help me out here too. From a sort of efficacy of the dose, I don't think that's necessarily the question. I think the question is, how long can you go without getting the second dose? Right. And so again, the guidance was 4 days before the 21 or 4 days before the 28, because that's how the clinical trial was set up. What we expect is that, and there's some data that's lining up with that in other countries, that they're having, England, for example, pushed it to 6 weeks, and the CDC aligned with that a couple of weeks ago. There's an expectation that you can get it up to 6 or even potentially 8 weeks after the first dose. So again, I think, I know that in El Paso, there's a lot of angst that was created about not getting it exactly on that 21 or 28 day mark. But I think because of supply chain issues, if it's stretched a little bit, that's not a concern for the efficacy of the vaccine.
Is that?
That's completely correct. I mean, I think the other thing is that setting a number makes people, it gives people a date. If you just said, hey, maybe you take your first dose and I tell you, hey, come back somewhere around maybe 2 or 3 weeks, or come back in about a month. If I give you a specific time, you're going to be more likely to come back and get
Absolutely.
that shot. But if I give you a range, or if I give you, say, maybe in a couple of weeks, come back, you'll be more likely not to return and get that second dose. So I think it's even more important there's not something special about 28 days or 21 days in the sense of, magically 28 days, your antibodies drop off. But it is important to stick to that schedule, because that schedule has been evaluated in a clinical setting, and you need to stay as close to that as possible. But it's not something that's going to, be detrimental if you don't come back the exact day. But I think they just want to make sure people return for that second dose.
Absolutely.
One quick question about that. Someone, Bria Blunt asked, can you take the vaccine while on antibiotics?
Yes,
You can.
ma'am.
Another question, there's been some cases reported in the news that some people, example given, Hank Aaron, died shortly after receiving the vaccine. Did the COVID vaccine accelerate his death? And that's from Karen L.
Yeah, there's no evidence to that. And again, I think, it's one of those things, right? Cancer and heart disease kill people every single day. In fact, I think they kill 10,000 people a day. Some of those 10,000 people are going to get a COVID vaccine. COVID vaccine didn't kill them. Their cancer and their heart disease killed them. And so Hank Aaron's family put out a statement. His physician put out a statement. We know how it is. Once the press gets a hold of anything that's crazy, they seem to want to run with crazy more than common sense. So it is the world of spin that we live in. But yeah, that's not the case.
Okay. This is from Harold Rice. I'm glad you're addressing transmission. So my question centers around the virus not being able to use its key to get into the lock. So does the virus sit dormant, waiting to pick the lock? Does it start to mutate within the body or dies?
That's a good question. So in general, especially if you have antibodies, so that's the beauty of an antibody response. So we talk about keys and locks. I'm glad I'm glad to know that example stuck, because you used it perfectly. The keys and locks. So the key, if it's covered by those antibodies, the beauty about the immune system, and this is something that I just get excited about, because the immune system is just an amazing operating system. It works. It never shuts down. If those antibodies coat that virus, they also flag that virus to be removed from the immune system. So that antibody coating, it's not just coating and the virus is like trying to shake it off and get back to your cell. Once they coat, they stick to it and they send up a flare. And so now macrophages, which are cells that engulf and phagocytize and eat up stuff, they come in and remove that viral particle. They phagocytize it and put it in an acid bath. If you imagine an acid bath, they have things called lysosomes in their cytoplasm, and they're basically the digestion chambers. The virus goes into that, it's engulfed, and it's just destroyed. And that's why the antibody response is so important, because if it coats it, it's going to call its guys. The macrophages come in. We need to get this dude out of here, and boom, they eat him, and he's gone. And so no, it doesn't just hang around and look to try to get to your cells, but that's why a really good, robust antibody response is so important.
Dr. Alozi, do you have anything to add to that?
No, ma'am.
Okay. How do you quarantine? This is from Lauren Simmons. How do you quarantine and practice healthy hygiene if you live in a shelter?
Ooh, that's immensely difficult. I think I sort of alluded to that in the beginning when we're talking about Swiss cheese models. And how do you do Swiss cheese when you have 7 people living in 1,100 square feet? Or when you have 2 kids in school, plus 2 elderly parents, plus 2 workers, and they're essential, either delivery or healthcare, whatever the case is. I mean, you truly can't. And the reality is, if you're in that situation, I mean, in an ideal world, you'd hope that your community, like they do in some communities, provides alternative housing, either hotels that have been hit 50 to 60% in occupancy, or alternative care site isolation that they've been doing in many cities that have set up alternative care sites. But if you are in a home where you can't isolate and everybody else is negative, then the best thing to do is continue to wear a mask. Continue to wear a mask, practice the best hand hygiene that you can. It's not a perfect situation, but it's better than doing it without a mask at the very least. And so I think you have to make the best of an imperfect situation.
Dr. Moore, do you have anything to add to that?
I can't make that statement any better.
Okay.
I
I think this one will be for both of you all. It is
Right.
from Judy Holzar. Is there any data with HIV positive persons and vaccines/COVID?
Yeah, so the pre-enrollment piece didn't target HIV specifically, but the post hoc analysis showed that there were people living with HIV that got the vaccine. There were no issues in any of those people living with HIV. I mean, one thing that we've seen that we initially thought that HIV would be a more affected class than others because of the historical immunosuppression. But I think one thing that we've seen is that because so many people are on the right antiretroviral therapy regimens and have immunity, which is CD4 and CD8, which is also involved in battling COVID, have immunity that's so much better that they were actually doing okay, right? So I think the key is persons living with HIV need to take their medication, ensure that they're on the right antiretroviral therapy and suppressed, and they should not be afraid of getting the COVID vaccine because they believe it may do them harm. They need to continue that protection alongside any other person that's at risk.
Okay. Well, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, sorry. This is one of the last points I want to make. So we didn't talk about it, but Dr. Alozi definitely had it in his presentation, and I want to make sure that it's something that people understand. I got a couple of questions over the last couple of months about whether or not these mRNA vaccines can affect your DNA. I keep hearing that, and I want to, for one thing is that, as I talked about earlier, when early mRNA vaccines were designed, the mRNA had a hard time surviving in the cell or surviving the process of being injected and getting into the cell. So that shows the fragility of mRNA in itself. But once in the cell, it can do its job. So I want everybody the people who are still on, I'm gonna take you back to 7th, 8th grade biology, and we start talking about cells, cytoplasm, and nucleus. So the nucleus is where your DNA is. So if you imagine you take an egg and you drop it into you crack it and you drop it into a hot frying pan. You have the yellow in the middle and you have the white around the edge. The white around the edge, all the white is a cytoplasm. The yellow is a nucleus. The yellow is where your DNA is. The cytoplasm is where all the other work happens, all the other, if you imagine all the other organelles that do the work of the cell. So the mRNA, when it enters the cell, it enters in that white area. And the ribosomes that we talked about, which actually make, translates the signal and the message and goes to make the protein, that all happens in the white. It never goes into the yellow, never gets DNA is. So, and once it has done its job, once that message has been read and translated by the by the ribosome, then the mRNA is just discarded. It's done its job. It's degraded. So that just lets you know, once again, if you have a question about whether or not it affects your DNA, that's not the case. It never makes it into the nucleus, never gets to interact with your DNA. But but that's the same principle that's happened over the years. Every virus that if you had flu before, flu viruses use the same mechanism basically that we're talking about. And if that's the case, then you have flu virus RNA integrated with your DNA if that were the case, anything that we get infected with. So that's not the case. You're protected from that. It doesn't interact with your DNA. Don't worry about that. Everything happens in the cytoplasm.
Okay, and if someone's had COVID, they have to wait 3 months to get the vaccine, right?
That's not correct.
What is it?
So they can get the vaccine as long as they're not actively ill. And I think the actively ill piece is around transmission more than anything else. There's no issue around their immune system not working. But I mean, I think in the spirit of being cautious to not spread, you want to do the same thing you would do if you were sick. You wait until 10 to 14 days, whatever it is in your community guidance. And then when you feel better, you go and get your vaccine. The 90 days conversation has been about the monoclonal antibody infusion, specifically because there's a belief or a fear that those antibodies will reduce your body's ability to respond properly. And so that's where the 90 days comes.
Okay. All right. Well, Dory has to jump off. I believe Dr. Alozi has to jump off. I would like to give Dory the opportunity to say 2 quick things she wanted to say before she jumps off. Dory, can you unmute her, or can she unmute herself?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chastity, again for doing this. I just wanted to thank the doctors, Dr. Moore and Dr. Alozi, for taking your time out of your Saturday to help spread this word for the community. We so needed to hear all of this. And I hope you all get to look at the chats, not only for the questions, but to see the appreciation that's coming from all the participants. We are so glad to know that you all are on the front lines, both in the clinical and the research capacity. Is really, to your point, Dr. Moore, saving the lives of our communities. I just don't know that people really understand that it is life or death, and you all are at the front lines and doing that. So I just wanted to say thank you, and to let all the participants know, to some degree, I feel like we're preaching to the choir for those who want to know and want to learn, but I appreciate you for being here and hope that you will continue to spread the word. We at the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago will have this link of this whole recording on our YouTube site. So please go there after this recording. Give us a couple days, because I don't know that everybody gonna work on Sunday. So give us a couple days to put it out there. And then we will definitely continue to share this word, because we can't stop until everyone in our community at least hears this and make informed decisions about what was presented today. And I'll say one more shout out to Chastity and Ty for, again, all these folks are here volunteering because they care about our communities. And so I just thank all of you for doing this, and we will continue to spread the word so that we can continue to see the lives of our community saved. Because this is the most, for us, one of the most important civil rights actions that we could be taking right now to see the advancement of this within our community. So thank you all. I just cannot praise you all enough for everything you're doing. But check out the chats, because a lot of people feel the same way.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I wanted to thank Dr.
Y'all made it
Moore.
easy. I can understand it. So this is huge. So thank you.
Hey, I wanted to thank Dr. Moore, Ian. I mean, okay, it's been great, man. I hope we can do this again. This has been really good.
We should do this again.
Yeah, no, we definitely need to do this again, because it's been one of the most exciting, and I like the vibe, man. So let's continue to help our community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was an amazing freestyle. We came kind of off the dome with this one. We didn't
Exactly.
People may have thought we practiced this, but that was pretty cool. We just kind of went back and forth.
You drop mics. If we're going now from the football to the rap analysis, and y'all can drop the mics on that one, because y'all killed it. And Chaz, thank you so much. Love you, hon. It's so good to see you.
No, good to see you too.
God bless everybody.
Dr. Moore, stay on.
Yes.
Dr. Alohi, thank you so much. Dr. Moore, we have some more questions specifically around breastfeeding, people getting the vaccine and breastfeeding.
Sure.
And then we have another question that came in the chat from someone named Kat. So I just wanted to make sure that these questions get answered because we said all questions would get answered.
Okay.
So if you could please talk around if a breastfeeding mother, is it safe for them to get the vaccine while they're they're still breastfeeding, and if it's been tested and or studied in that population?
So I think it probably goes along with pregnancy. I'm sure that lactating women were probably not directly included in the study. But what I'm going to say is that if you look back at the study in hindsight, there were probably people who were either early pregnant that were in that group. But luckily, with the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, what I can say is that once again, this goes back to the protein being produced by the mRNA. It's just a protein that's generating antibodies. So, in breast milk, period, women and animals across mammals who breastfeed, period, have what they call colostrum. And these are just antibodies that the mother passes along to the baby shortly after birth. And so, this is just antibody that's being generated. So there's no virus in it once again. So I can't see anything that would be detrimental to a baby breastfeeding. The mother is going to have an antibody response. But once again, I'm also sure that was not included in the initial group because pregnant women were not identified as a group at that time. So I don't think it would have an issue. But once again, this is something that I would talk to if you're pregnant or if you are lactating and you're breastfeeding, I would probably just talk to your physician or your doctor and see what they think about it, because I wouldn't want to give you too much information about that.
And I can also ask Dr. Alohi. This is actually my cousin that asked the question, so I'll ask Dr. Alohi his thoughts. She also had a question about fertility. I think one of her friends had a question about fertility in the vaccine with,
Yeah, no, and there's no effect. There's no effect on fertility. Once again, it just goes back to the mechanism of the vaccine. It does not. There's nothing that it would have, and there's nothing to suggest it would have an adverse reaction on your fertility.
Okay. And this one is kind of long. It's from Carrie Sims. I'm in favor of vaccines. I'm concerned about the different types versus the company making them. The process for Johnson & Johnson vaccine is totally different from Pfizer. Frankly, J&J effective percentages isn't high enough for me. That, along with their history makes me uncomfortable. Their brand is no longer reputable in the Black community. One concern is that they target them in the Black community and we won't get vaccinated. Moving forward, how would a Pfizer booster work for a person that received a J&J vaccine? Although the goal is to get everyone vaccinated now, it looks like we are possibly headed for a COVID-19 management nightmare. If J&J were so slow with their initial request, I'm not confident that they can manage variants in a timely fashion. Also, I received a Pfizer vaccine and I'm looking forward to my second. I had no complications since the second shot created some minor flu-like symptoms. I'm increasing my water, zinc, vitamin C, and modifying food choices. I also take a daily ginger shot with honey and lemon. What do you recommend to help build up my immunity prior to taking vaccines? And that's from, she signed it Kat, but it's Carrie Sims in her email. Okay. I know that was a lot. I wanted to get her more questions. Get her
and that's fine.
There,
that's fine. I mean, so those, some of those more holistic approaches that she mentioned about generating immunity or building up immunity. The bottom line is that the vaccine is going to give you an immune response. So immunity as a general term is very kind of non-specific, but we're talking about immunity specifically because these antibodies that are being generated are going to be antibodies that are generated to the spike protein. So you can have an immune response be built up, but we're talking about immunity to spike protein. So in this case, getting a vaccine is going to be enough for you to get an immune response. And then when you get your second dose, you're going to get that extra boost you need to protect yourself against any infection. And with the J&J vaccines and stuff, I won't speak too much to those. They do use different technology than They do use a different technology than Pfizer and Moderna, but what I will say is that you need, as Dr. Alozi and I talked about earlier, you see that 66 number, you need to pay attention down lower to that 85% number, which is the protection, and then 100% protection against hospitalization and death. So those are the numbers that are more important. But what I'm also knowing that I think they're looking at it, but right now it's probably smart to continue the injection regimen that you have. So if you start with J&J, get J&J, or J&J is actually one shot. But if you start with Pfizer, finish with Pfizer. Don't mix vaccines. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they're telling you not to do it right now, but there may be something down the line where they might try to figure out if it's possible. But right now, if you get a Moderna first, get Moderna second. That's why they give you a card and tell you to come back in so many days, because they want to make sure you come back, and they're trying to regiment those doses. So they have one for you now and hopefully one for you when you come back 28 or 21 days later, respectively.
And I have a question. So it was in the chat about it being a yearly vaccine like the flu shot, right?
Right.
And so
right.
I guess this will kind of tie into that. First of all, is it going to be a yearly vaccine like the flu shot or the flu vaccine? And then if so, if you get the Moderna 1 year, can you get the Pfizer the next year? Or if you start with Moderna, can you go down to J&J the next year if you feel that it's going to be a yearly thing?
Right. Now that's a good question. So that's a two-part question. You getting a it probably will. I'm saying it probably will. There's a very high likelihood that this could become endemic, and if it becomes endemic, meaning that it's just kind of hanging around in smaller infection levels, it could become something that you have to get yearly. It could be a situation where you go in and you get a flu shot, and you get a coronavirus booster. It's very possible. And in particular, because if people don't get vaccinated in the numbers that vaccination suffocates this virus. It doesn't allow it to replicate, and it doesn't allow it to make new variants that can evade vaccines. But if you don't get vaccinated, then it allows it to keep going. And there are going to be certain populations of people who this virus, because the virus is going to try to survive, and it's going to try to find people who are not vaccinated. And if it gets to them, then it can replicate, and it can go to the next person. So that is what helps it become endemic. But if you are to get vaccinated, then you can help suffocate this virus out, and potentially it could be eradicated, but it would have to be a large number of people get vaccinated. Now, with that being said, if you get vaccinated 1 year with one vaccine, then yeah, absolutely, because you have an antibody response. But after a year, then potentially you could use another vaccine to essentially get. It's the same thing with the flu virus. I get a flu vaccine this year. The flu vaccine is developed based on what's circulating the next year. And so that's essentially it could be a slightly different vaccine. So yeah, you could definitely get a different vaccine from a different provider. But the problem that we don't know right now is how long immunity lasts. And you get a coronavirus vaccine this year, or 2 vaccines or whatever, depending on the source, you get a antibody response. Now the question is, because we haven't had time to go to the end and see what's protective and what's not, that's going to be information that's available as we go along. You'll know what number is protected. You potentially can get your blood drawn, and they can do antibody titers and say, oh, well, your titers are 1,200. That's great. That's very protective, because the minimum is 600. So you're really good. But we don't have that information now. So that's why it's going to be important for you to probably get a booster from time to time until that is determined, or until long-term immunity is established, or until the virus is eradicated. So one of those 3 situations. Okay. Yep.
Well, I think we're done here. Does anyone have any questions? Would anyone like to come on camera? Dr. Moore, I'm gonna ask you to hold on with myself and Ty when everyone hangs up.
Okay.
What I would like to do definitely is to thank everyone. We still have 40 people on, and we've been on for over 2 hours. Well, a little bit, probably at 2 hours now. I think this was great. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm really big on bringing education to our community, because I understand the health disparities, and I understand education is key. So in order to bridge that gap and close those gaps, we have to educate our communities. And I'm really grateful and thankful for everyone who joined. I'm grateful for the YWCA, Dr. Moore, And of course, Dr. Alozi, of course, Ty, which is my cousin who always provides the Zoom link. So I really want to say thank you all for hanging in there. Thank you for joining. And I think we have a list. Ty, do we have a list? Because if we do another one, can we send out invitations? Ty?
I'll have to check and see if the emails of everybody that registered here saves, but we should be able to do that.
Okay. Okay. If there's anyone who has any extra questions or just want to say something to Dr. Moore, myself, or Ty,
I see two
feel
hands
free
raised.
to come online.
There are two hands raised.
They can unmute
Hey,
themselves.
Dr. Moore.
Yes.
Hey, this is well, I know you don't know me, but anyway, this is Derek Polk in Houston.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you, just you and Dr. Logie, just for the amazing information, and I want to thank Chastity for putting this on and putting this together, and everybody who supported her in organizing it. But
Absolutely.
the docs did an outstanding job. I just got a question. I took the first dose of the Moderna, and I'm scheduled to get my second dose next week. I got it done at a specialty pharmacy here in Houston.
Okay.
And the situation is I did get an alert saying that they hadn't received their shipment and that I may not, me and others, we may not be able to get it next week through that pharmacy.
Okay.
That it could be delayed. And what I wanted you to speak to is they're saying now it could be up to 42 days. I mean, in terms from when you get your first to your second, it can be extended. Is that true?
Yeah. So I mean, once again, I mean, the ideal scenario, and that's actually what Dr. Lozzi was talking about right before he got off. You know, in some cases, they were mentioning that even up to 8 weeks could pass in between. So essentially right now, for the Pfizer vaccine, it's 21 days, and for Moderna, it's 28 days. But essentially, you could almost, and that's a month. So you could almost double that time with some of the vaccines. So you won't be, you know, there won't be any serious detrimental effect if you go a little bit longer. It's just that they wanted to, you know, they want to try to keep these shots as close as possible. And a month from a strategic standpoint, a month is a functional time for you to get a vaccine, and then for you to come back and get one. It's kind of in the same month almost, or at least beginning of 1 month and the beginning of the next month. But if they, like I said, if they stretch it out and they say we'll come back anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, there are going to be a lot of people who don't come back because of that. So I wouldn't be too terribly concerned about it. But as soon as it's available, you go get it. And, you know, like I said, and there will be, and I mentioned that before, there will be some side effects. You will have, and I'm not going to say there will be. Some people have experienced side effects, but those side effects mean that your immune system was responding. So if anything, you accept that immune response and accept those side effects, because that means that your body is recognizing that and giving you a stronger boost in antibody response.
Okay, would you recommend taking like maybe Advil right before, before on the day of?
Yeah, you could absolutely just pre-treat yourself, because you might have a headache, but you may not have anything. Some people have no response at all, and they're just another sore arm, and that's it. But you could absolutely take something if you don't feel great, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Tina Wilcher, and I want to say thank you all for hosting this very informative meeting. I'm a 48-year-old African-American woman. I've totally been against vaccinations because my daughter, when she was 2 or 3 years old, received pertussis vaccination and caught whooping cough. And so that really scared the crap out of our family. And we have totally avoided vaccines from that point forward. And really to hear from some African-American doctors who have an inside scoop, I would say, on it has blessed me today, because now I can make a more informed decision, because I know that my voice matters to the rest of my family. And if I say no, then the other people in my household and my family members are going to go against it as well. So I appreciate you all, you know, sharing this very, very informative information with us, because I'm gonna pass it on. And I looked up my numbers and I'm like behind 24 million. So I ain't gonna get it no time soon anyway. But I do thank you all for letting me know when it becomes available that I should be in line.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that actually, you know, that spot in line may change. as vaccines become available, as emergency use authorization is granted to other vaccines, that space may change. But if nothing else, I'm gonna tell you right now, and what you just said means the absolute most to me, because that's the whole point. I didn't come on here, and I told Chastity this before we even started talking. I said, I'm not coming on here to tell anybody you have to take a vaccine, you need to get back. I'm telling people I want to make sure you have the right information so you can make an informed decision. Now, do I think you should? Absolutely. Can I make you get it? Absolutely not. It's something where, but if I give you the facts and give you and as Dr. Alozi laid out, the statistics, you can make the right decision. And as you just mentioned, as a matter of fact, they've have a couple of studies talking about the role that women play in families when it comes to health and health care. And so you may set the most powerful example for your family, but not even just your family, your immediate friends, because in a lot of communities, but in particular in Black communities, we go by what's familiar, what's common, who we know. Oh yeah, I know that she got it, so and she's okay. I'm gonna go ahead and get it. And that it's the relatability, it's the relationships that we have. And so that's kind of that's the whole point. You get comfortable and understand what the process is. You make a decision for yourself, and hopefully that decision spreads like ripples in a pond.
Hi, this is Janice Davis.
Hello.
And hi, Chastity. Thanks for inviting us to this Zoom. I think Stacy told you she's in the hospital right now.
Yeah,
but
I was gonna ask. I just got her question. I was gonna ask him about sickle cell, but go ahead, Miss Davis.
The main question that we have is first with the vaccine. Has there been any information that taking the vaccine has thrown a sickle cell anemia patient into a crisis? And then the second part, which I'm sure I would know the answer, that getting COVID would possibly throw a sickle cell patient into a crisis. But the main thing is with the vaccine. Is there any information about that?
Not that I know of, but once again, this goes back to the people who were initially admitted in the trial. And this is why, and this is another point. Thank you for raising that question. It's actually a really good question. That question actually raises a point of our participation in clinical trials. Black people, we have questions about whether or not something affects us, but we won't participate in clinical trials. And so what happens is now in a situation like this, like I would assume that because of the prevalence of sickle cell disease or sickle cell traits in African Americans, I would imagine that somebody that was in the trial or has been vaccinated has sickle cell or has sickle cell trait. And so if that is the case, I have not seen anything in particular negative about, people going into crisis following vaccination. But what I will tell you is that I would say this goes back to risk versus the potential protection and outcome. I would definitely suggest that if you should be more concerned about especially in any person with an immune compromised scenario, you should be more concerned about what the virus could do to you, potentially more so than even what a vaccine could do to you, especially with these vaccines, because they are so safe, in fact. So I have not seen anything in particular about sickle cell disease in the vaccine trials. But what I would tell you is that this is a situation where you go and talk to your physician and see what they have to tell you. But I would probably tell you they're probably going to suggest that you go ahead and get vaccinated, or whoever gets vaccinated, because the risk of disease from the virus is far greater than the potential risk from a mRNA vaccine.
Right, and she can't wait to get the vaccine, actually. One other question while I'm on.
Yes.
Is there a higher incident of this vaccine causing the development of an autoimmune disease more so than any other vaccine?
No.
Okay.
And as a matter, not at all. Not at all. This vaccine, once again, I go back to I know I sound like a broken record, but this vaccine is really safe. And the only thing you're getting out of this is antibody response. Whereas some, like I said, traditional vaccines use a little bit of the virus. This case, you're just using something that is a piece of what the virus looks like and telling your body to make antibodies to that, so that when you do get it and you come into contact with the virus, your body already knows what it looks like, and it can coat and cover those spikes that we talked about, and then that virus part of can be removed. So that's it. So no other information related to autoimmune disorders or anything like that. I mean, outside of some of the major illnesses, they're recommending a whole lot of people get vaccinated. And it's not just a random, like, just go get your shot. This is really well thought out, and it's a really safe vaccine. And so they want people to be protected, because you just don't want to risk, what the outcome could be if you were to get sick with COVID.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for putting this on.
Absolutely. Oh, that's all Chastity. Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, Davis. Tell Stacy I'll call her later. Does anyone else have any questions?
There's one more hand raise.
Yeah, I see that.
Ms. Blunt, I think.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm not sure if I missed it, but it wasn't when you were speaking. It was when the last doctor was speaking. He was talking about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine list, where
Yes.
he was showing the funding. So he was talking about that the top one was India, I think, or an A.
Yes.
And he said something about they haven't released their information. Did we give funding to them and they haven't released the information? I was confused on his statement.
No, I think I'm gonna pull up that slide real quick, but I'm pretty sure that let me see. I'm pretty sure that I think he was just more so talking about the countries that have been buying doses, but India I think has an agreement with one of the European vaccines, and here it is right here. Sorry. Secured. So those because India actually, India has one of the largest populations on the planet. I mean, they have, I can't remember the exact number, but they have like 6 or 7 billion, sorry, 6, 7, yeah, maybe they have 1 billion people, I think, in India. So they purchased a lot of doses from different companies. A lot of countries, what they did is they actually purchased doses before these vaccines were even approved, just to be ahead of the game. Because if you waited, then you're going to be in a situation where there's going to be vaccine already committed to other countries. So India was one of the countries that purchased 1.6 billion doses to cover the population that they have. So that funding, we didn't fund them. All the funding was for US companies. And then even, I think, is it Pfizer? Pfizer, I think, was one of the companies that did not take government funding, if I'm not mistaken. They produce it on their own.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any more questions? If not, Ty, did you see whether or not you have the list of the people?
I have it. It's hard to check when it's running though, but I have the people that registered, yes.
Okay, so everyone that registered, we have their email. So if we do another one, we can email them.
Yep.
Okay, so we have your email addresses. If we do something within the next month or so, or update to the information, if the doctors want to do that, then we'll make sure you guys are contacted. So be on the lookout for Mr. Redmond's email. And thank you for spending a few hours with us this Saturday morning. Please go spread the word. And if you're one of our Facebook friends, we will, myself, Dory, the YWCA of Metropolitan Chicago metropolitan area, we'll all have this information on the website, on our Facebook pages, and I think on Twitter. So you'll have access to the call. You can have access to the slides if you would like them. And just thank you again, and stay safe, please.
Absolutely.
Take Dr. care. Moore, stay online, Dr. Moore.
I will.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.